Workbench, let's have a look at what MySQL Workbench actually is and how we're going to be using it. So MySQL Workbench is an integrated development environment for the MySQL database system. This means that it's a visual tool for database design, database administration and SQL development. So we're going to be writing all our SQL code and queries in MySQL Workbench. Now we could use the command line to do this, but MySQL Workbench gives us a nice visual tool and it's a much more intuitive way to write our SQL queries. So now that we know what MySQL Workbench is, let's take a quick tour of MySQL Workbench before we start writing our first SQL queries in the next lesson. So if you haven't already, the first thing I want you to do is open MySQL Workbench so you can see this page. And once you've done that, we can click into Dev User. Now once you click into Dev User, you're going to see a page appear like this, or a screen appear like this. And this is where we're going to be spending the majority of our time in this course. As you can see, there's a lot of features in MySQL Workbench. You can see we have a lot of links on the left hand side here, the left hand side menu. We also have a ribbon at the top here, and we have this sort of notepad page open here called Query 1 tab, and we also have another ribbon along the top here with even more functions. Now this video is just going to be a quick tour of MySQL Workbench, as we don't need to know every single detail about MySQL Workbench right now. So like I said, we're going to be using MySQL Workbench to write all our SQL queries, and we're going to be doing that here. So this is like a notepad page, and this is where we can actually come in and start writing our SQL query. So I'll write a couple of queries now. Don't worry if you don't understand this. We're going to be going through this later on in the course, but this is what an SQL query generally looks like. So we have select star from a table, and then we have select star from another table, so table 1 and table 2, and then each SQL query ends in a semicolon. So this semicolon is telling MySQL that the query has ended. So MySQL knows that the query starts here with this select and finishes with this semicolon, and then it knows that this second query here starts here after this semicolon and runs to the next semicolon, which is here. So MySQL knows that these are two distinct SQL queries because of these semicolons. So every SQL query ends in a semicolon. So now that we've written some SQL queries, we need to know how to run them in Workbench. And to do that, we need to go to this top ribbon here, which is in the Query tab. And if we hover over each of the icons, we can actually see what they do. It gives a brief description. So we can see that this one is to open a script file in this editor. So if you have already written a script and saved it to your computer, you can open it using this icon here. And if you need to save a script for later use, then you can use this icon here. So this is to save scripts that you've already written. So if you want to save this script, for example, with these two queries, you can click on this button, save it to your PC, and then open it later using this first icon. But for running queries, we're actually interested in these next four icons. So these three lightning bolts and this hand with the red background. So these three lightning bolts are for running queries, and then this red hand is for stopping a query which is in progress. So if we hover over the first lightning bolt, we can see it says execute the selected portion of the script or everything if there is no selection. So by script, it means whatever's written in this notepad block here. So it's saying, if I get the description up again, it's saying execute the selected portion of the script or everything if there's no selection. So I can select a portion of a script like this, just clicking and dragging, And then if I click this lightning bolt, it's just going to run what I've selected, so this first query. If I hadn't made a selection, I just had my cursor down here and click this lightning bolt, it's going to run the first query and then it's going to run the second query straight afterwards. Now this second lightning bolt works slightly differently. It's going to execute the statement under the keyboard cursor. So if we had our keyboard cursor here within the first query, so it's between the start of the query here and the first semicolon, it's just going to run this first query because that's the only one that's under the cursor. But if we moved the cursor pointer here and click this button, then it's going to run the second query. Now this third lightning bolt works slightly differently again. It's going to execute the explain command on the statement under the cursor. So basically what that means is if we had our cursor here to run the second query, it's going to run the query, but it's also going to explain what it's doing behind the scenes, so how MySQL is running this query. So that can be quite useful, although I tend not to use this one so much. So when I'm running queries, I'm mainly going to be using these first two lightning bolts to actually run the query. And then finally this red hand is to stop the query being executed. So if you're running a query which is retrieving thousands or tens of thousands of rows of data and it's taking a very long time and you want to stop the query rather than waiting for it to finish, you can click this red hand and it's going to stop the query. And then the other important icon along this top ribbon is this icon here which says limit to 1000 rows. So again, if you're retrieving data from a table which has hundreds of thousands of rows of data, but you don't want to retrieve every row, you can limit your results to a certain number. So by default, it's set to limit to 1000 rows, but you can click the up and down arrow to change this to whatever value you want, 50 up to 50,000 rows. And the benefit of using this is that obviously it's a lot quicker to run a query which is only going to retrieve 1000 rows rather than 100,000 rows. So that's it for this top ribbon. Now let's actually run one of these queries. So let's run this first query here and see what happens. You can see we got a menu pop up at the bottom here, and this is our action output. So when you run an SQL query, you're going to get action output, or you're going to get some data which is output from the bottom here. So if you run a successful query, you're going to get data returned, but if you run an incorrect query, you're going to get an error, and that's what happened in this case. You can see it's an error because we've got a little red X here rather than a green tick. And in the action output, it's also showing you what action was taken. So it selected star from table 1, and we had that limit to 1000 rows which was stated here. Now don't worry again if you don't understand this action. We're going to be going through selecting data from tables later on in this course in really much more detail. So don't worry about that for now. And we also get this response, so this error code, so it's telling us why it failed. And again, don't worry if you don't understand this, but it's saying no database selected, so it wasn't able to run this query correctly. So now we know how to run our SQL queries, we know how to get some output from the bottom here. Let's take a look at this left hand side. So I'm just going to briefly go through this left hand side, as a lot of it is not super useful for this course, for a beginner's course. So let's quickly go through it. So under this management tab, we have this server status. So if we double click on that, we get a new tab opened, which is called administration server status. And then we have some stats on our server. So we can see here that it's running, our server is running. You can see the load on the server, you can see the number of connections, and you can see traffic and efficiency. So again, this isn't super useful information for this course, but it's good to know it's there if you're having issues with MySQL Workbench. And then the next tab is client connections. So if we double click on that, we can see more detail on which clients are connecting to our server. And then the final tab we'll look at in the management list is users and privileges. And this is where we can see what users have access to our server, to our MySQL server, and we can also set privileges here. So we're actually going to be going through this tab in more detail in the next video, where we have to set privileges to our dev user. And then I want to go down to this performance, so the performance dashboard, and this shows us lots of performance stats on our network, on MySQL, and something called InnoDB. But again, we don't really need to use this. It's just good to know it's there if we're having issues with MySQL. But the most important thing on this left hand side is actually under the schemas. So a database schema is basically a database diagram. It's showing us what tables are in our database, and it's showing us relationships and other information within our database. So you can see here there's a list of databases. You can tell they're databases because of this symbol here, this sort of stacked cylinder. That's the symbol for a database. And you can see their names of the database here. So you won't have Cinema Booking System or Coffee Store database yet, because we're actually going to be creating both of these databases in the course. So you'll have a few others listed. I think you have 4 listed. But if you go to this drop down triangle here and click on that, you can see within the Coffee Store database we have tables, and we have other objects called views, stored procedures, and functions. And then you can see we have a drop down by the tables, so we can click on that and you can see what tables are within the Coffee Store database. And then if you click on customers table, you can see even more information. So you can see here we have the table name customers, and then we also have the columns within the customers table. So you can see the customers table has 5 columns within it, and then we also have some more information here. But again, we're going to be going through this later in the course, so don't worry if this looks like gobbledygook for now. We'll be explaining it later in the course. You can also click on the other tables to find out information about them as well. So this database schema is very useful for seeing what tables you've created, what databases you've created, and more information on the tables here. So that's pretty much it for our MySQL Workbench tour. Again, the most important thing is to know that we have to write our queries here. We can run them using this ribbon at the top here, and we get our output at the bottom here. It's also good if you can have a look through the database schemas. That can be quite interesting and useful. But most of the links under management, instance, and performance just aren't very